So I wanted to talk to you all about a story that I've heard on the news for a little while, about half a month now. I wanted to wait until more data came out, more information, because it's not really something that I want to talk about without getting that sort of information. But over here, this article at Reuters, it's titled Exclusive, EPA Eyes Limits for Agricultural Chemical Linked to Crop Damage. And this is in reference to the recent application of Dicamba, the recent sort of volatilization of the compound, or at least that's what's being asserted by companies like Monsanto and DuPont and BASF. I'm not as interested in the story itself, although I think that it bears merit to talk about many of the aspects. I wanted to mostly use this as a sort of jumping off point to talk about a highly sort of underestimated aspect of pesticides in general. I am somebody who does not consider all pesticides to be equal. I don't also necessarily consider all pesticides to be bad, right? So I wanted to talk about that first and sort of define my terms. So a pesticide is just a chemical or a compound or some sort of a thing that you use to control maybe a pest of some kind, right? That's why it's called a pesticide. So what does that mean? That means fungi, that means insects, that means rodents, that means anything that's a pest, right? Anything. That includes plants too. In addition to that, they're not all man-made, they're not all synthetic, right? So right off the bat, sulfur, that's a pesticide. Absolutely. And I'm not using the formal definitions here. I'm sort of speaking colloquially here. But there are very specific definitions that like the EPA and other organizations utilize. And that's very important because without those definitions, people wouldn't understand exactly what people are talking about. And you sort of lose control of the situation and the conversation if you're not both talking about the same terms. You might talk past each other, and that's not good, obviously. So cards on the table. I don't consider every single pesticide to be bad. In fact, I consider many of them to be okay or good. It just depends on the crop. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on a lot of factors, which I can't answer all of them in one short video. But I can try to have a conversation about the improper use of certain pesticides, because some pesticides are quite toxic. Absolutely, no, you'll not hear an argument from me about how a lot of pesticides tend to be not so good for the human body, and definitely not good for the pests, which is the whole point of their existence. Dicamba is an herbicide, and it has been the causal agent in about 3.5% of crop damage for this in this situation here. That's what the Reuters article says. 3.5% of the, let me get it here. Underneath risky drift, it says here, about 3.1 million acres of soybeans vulnerable to dicamba were hurt by sprayings this summer, accounting for 3.5% of U.S. plantings, according to the University of Missouri. So what does that mean, right? Well, 3.1 million acres is a ton of land, right? But somehow it's only 3.5% of U.S. plantings. What do they mean by U.S. plantings? I'm not exactly sure, actually, to be honest. I don't know if they mean all agriculture or if they simply mean the soybeans. It could just mean soybeans. I'm not surprised. We grow a lot of soybeans and many other sort of staple crops in the U.S. and other places, certainly. I think that is what they mean. I think they mean 3.1 million acres of soybeans is 3.5% of soybean plantings. At least grammatically, that's what would make sense. So I'm going to go with that. But yeah, so that's a ton of land. And what's being sort of explained as the cause, the issue, is sort of the improper use of pesticides, specifically dicamba here. What happens is that a lot of pesticides, they have what's called volatility. And volatility is an aspect or an attribute wherein which the compound can sort of off-gas into the air and then travel. And a lot of pesticides are like this, but a lot of people don't necessarily realize that. Even people who apply pesticides or are PCAs, although I hope that if they're certified they understand that and that they really that they really consider what they're doing. But sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's hard because for people who might not be agriculturalists themselves, they might not understand all of the different stressors and issues that go into growing. Whereas people who are intimately familiar with that process are very aware of all of the different issues. But that's sort of a topic for another time. I wanted to say that volatility is understated, and it really is. And this is a great example as to why, because in another part of the article, it was explained that they only did a 2 year abridged research instead of a 5-year time, and that sort of time frame is that's sort of telling in my opinion. That instead of spending the what's more common 5-year time span for research regarding dicamba, they only did 2 years of research before using it, and that could have prevented this monumental issue. The other thing that I think is important to realize is that when people misapply pesticides, it's totally on the label sometimes. Like, don't apply when it's really sunny. Don't apply it if you know that the winds are going to be kicking up. If you're in a place where there's a lot of wind, or if you're in a season where it's got a lot windier, don't use that. And why is that? That's because you might get this sort of issue where the compound off-gases and then travels. And you can't control where it travels because it goes wherever the wind blows. And in this case, the wind blew over people's crops where they were not growing crops that are resistant to this herbicide, right? So this is a technique that is very common. A lot of people are aware of it, but I'll go over it here. Essentially, what you do is you apply this herbicide over a crop that's resistant to the herbicide, and so that way you basically kill all the competing weeds in the grow space. You don't have to have somebody manually go out there and spray. You don't have to have somebody manually go out there and take out the plants. These are huge crops, obviously. These are huge, massive fields, right? They're not indoor facilities and all that. So what happens is that if the compound volatilizes and travels, that compound spreads wherever the wind takes it. And like I said, this would be one of those cases where other people's crops were damaged because somebody decided to spray it maybe when the wind was kicking up. This was happening around July and June, where sort of the news started to pick up this story. And that's summer. That's when it's hot. That's when this sort of volatilization happens a lot more. On a macro scale, the summer season is hotter, and so that is usually when this kind of a thing happens more often. On the micro scale, the hottest part of the day is the time of the day that you don't want where you don't want to spray. If you know it's going to be very hot and there's a risk for phytotoxicity, you don't want to risk that. Sometimes phytotoxicity happens because that's just how the compound works, especially with other pesticides that are not targeted towards plants. but you may spray them in like insecticides, right? You spray them on your crops sometimes, and what'll happen is the sunlight or the heat or both can cause a bad reaction in the plant with the compound, or simply because the compound is on the leaves itself, that can cause a phytotoxic reaction as well. So, sometimes you might screw yourself up by not considering these sort of intricate details with your pesticides. The other big thing that I didn't see addressed necessarily in this article that I think is really important to consider is sort of the ecological ramifications. It's kind of like with honeybee species. Like people are upset a lot of times. People are kind of in a frenzy, some of them anyways, about honeybee population decline. And honeybees are basically livestock. It's important to note that unless you live in the endemic regions where honeybee species originate, they're basically not invasive, since that's sort of a term that means something very specific, but they are non-native. But a lot of bee species are native to other places in the world. Some of them make honey, but the vast majority of them are solitary bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, other kinds of things like that. And so when people get upset about the decline in honeybees, they only are aware of it because people study, people research, people have people have they keep these bees like livestock, and they have statistics that they can go to show that the bee population is going down in certain areas. And there's people who record these things for both apiarists and also people who are just looking at bees that have naturalized in the areas that they've been spread to. But nobody has that data for native bee populations, not nearly to the level they do for honeybees. And the same sort of problem is here. It's no telling. Obviously, it's going to be bad, but there's no telling really what's happening for different conifer species that are susceptible to dicamba. There's no telling what's happening to pest weed species that might have gotten a sublethal dose and might be, that might select for resistance in the future. And those are issues that are separate but related to this volatilization issue, because the article and the sort of the story is mostly focusing on how other people's crops, their livelihoods, have been really damaged by the application of dicamba, and the blame for a lot of people rests specifically on the companies making the compound, right? That not enough research was perhaps done on this specific compound, less than what is common according to this article. But the other issue is that, and the one that I want to focus on, is that the ecological damage is sort of hard to assess. But if the wind blew dicamba to the outskirts of somebody's property, that can have an effect on the local wildlife. It can have an effect on the biome that's obviously going to rely on plant life to some degree. And dicamba is pretty, it takes care of a lot of species of weeds. It acts on the physiology of the plant. It makes it kind of overexert itself to death. It's not a nice way to go out. But different tree species, it's going to affect a lot of things. And of course, that's going to have an effect on the insects and wildlife that feed on the plants in some capacity, right? And so it's really hard to tell that ecological damage. It's just hard to tell that. And I think that that's an important point to make, because the misapplication of pesticides is not rare. I've come across it. It's something that I'm intimately familiar with. Sometimes I come across people who don't realize what they're doing is going to be a problem or can be a problem. Sometimes they're aware that there might be an issue, but they're kind of stuck in a rock or between a rock and a hard place, right? Because they have pest pressures that they have to deal with. They might have, they might be financially struggling. They might know that, they have to make a choice whether or not to spray or to not spray. They might ruin their biocontrol, or they might ruin some other aspect of their treatment plan or their crop. But they're forced to because they can't deal with the weeds, or they can't deal, in this case, they can't deal with the weeds, or they can't deal with other aspects. And they're relying on this piece of technology to keep them afloat or to help them out. I sympathize. I definitely, more than sympathize, I empathize with being in that situation. And I think it's important to not throw people under the bus necessarily. When stories like this come out, it's important not to demonize, without understanding exactly what's going on. And like most things in the world, this sort of issue is nuanced, and it's hard to tell exactly everything, all the factors that are relevant. But that's about what I wanted to say. I didn't want to go too far. I didn't want to talk for too long about this, but to summarize my points, and I'm going to give you the article name again so that you can go and read the article yourself. It says here it's a 7-minute read. Probably, this is about 20 minutes or so 7-minute read, right? You can read it yourself, come to your own conclusions, do your own research, certainly. But if you have any questions or if you have any ideas or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Also, you can contact me on my Instagram, where I tend to share a lot of posts that are related to this with my own commentary and my opinions. And I'll be making more videos that are vocal and auditory and visual, like this one on YouTube. So the title is Exclusive: EPA Eyes Limits for Agricultural Chemical Linked to Crop Damage. Again, that chemical is Dicamba, the herbicide. And to summarize my points, it's not looking good for the people who produce this compound. They're looking to ban it in a lot of places. The EPA is getting involved in this, and they're taking it very seriously. I also would take it very seriously, and I think this is a good warning to people who maybe don't read the labels of their pesticides or don't really consider all of the intersectionality that goes into like a treatment regimen and what you're affecting ecologically, which can be environmentally unfriendly, to say the least. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. And I hope this has been interesting, food for thought. Leave a comment if you'd like to, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And feel free to send me news or articles or ideas or questions that you might have, and I might even make a video about it. Who knows? So take care.